Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome to Morning Musings here on Now TV. I appreciate you being with me so very, very much. I hope that you are still safe. I hope that you are observing the social distancing. I hope you are continuing in prayer, trusting in the Lord. Very, very sadly, a week or so ago, one person who follows me very closely on YouTube contacted me and let me know that his father had passed away from corona. And our hearts and our prayers and our condolences go out. And this is still a very, very serious situation. It disturbs me to no end. There are several things that disturb me about what's going on. Number one, the incredible abuse of political power on the part of some governors. I mean, they're acting like dictators. The incredible hypocrisy on the part of some. You know, in some states, if you go out in public without a mask, they will fine you or put you in jail. In another state, they came within one single vote of releasing convicted murderers because of the corona threat in the prison. Are you serious? Do politicians not have any common sense at all? Oh, well, that's kind of a self-answering question, it seems. But look, we got to use common sense. The Lord said that we're supposed to be harmless as doves, wise as serpents. Now, obviously, that's a Hebraism. It's a kind of a common saying. But the point of it is, we're supposed to use common sense. And thus, when we see, and we've seen it over and over again, unfortunately, we have seen individuals say, oh, this whole coronavirus, it's a charade, it's a facade, it's fake, it's a government conspiracy, and they violate the guidelines in place, and by the way, they catch corona and they die. Just recently, a fairly prominent minister got on YouTube, and the title of his YouTube, "This virus will not come here, will not come near you." And he declared it all a sham and a facade and a fake, and said because he believes in the Lord, he would not catch corona. He caught corona and he died. Look, folks, the Lord never promised to deliver us from every illness. He never promised to deliver us from our own, you'll have to excuse my language here, from our own stupidity. If we don't have enough common sense to take precautions against what is obviously going on in the world, there are consequences to be paid. And if you are one of those conspiracy theorists, and there are many, many, many of them out there, look, I tend not to be a conspiratorialist, all right? I'm not naive. I have watched some of the videos of people claiming this is all a hoax and a charade. And I have to tell you, the videos that I've watched so far, with one exception, but the videos I've watched so far have themselves been a charade. They have been ridiculous. And the great tragedy of it is, some of them are purporting to be teaching biblical truth. Many of them are claiming, oh, the corona, it's a sign that the great tribulation is near, that the end is near. Is near. No, folks. The corona is not a sign that the end is near. That's why I've been producing these programs now for this good long while, all these past several months, because I am wanting to help you to see what the Bible really says, honestly says, about the time of the end, about the signs of the end, those signs being present in the first century. Now, I've been sharing with you the challenge of Christ. I hope that you have your Bible in front of you today. I hope you have a notebook. I hope that you are willing to look seriously at the issues that are before us when we consider Jesus' word. Do not believe me for my words' sake, believe me for my works. If I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Folks, that's the challenge of Christ himself. Don't be like those who are so horribly naive as one of my debate opponents, a formal public debate that I had, two-night debate. And in that debate, I kept talking about we need solid exegesis. Now, what is exegesis? It's a big fancy word, right? Well, exegesis means literally to draw out from the text what is in the text. Now, the opposite of that is eisegesis. Eisegesis means to read into a text what is not there. So anyway, on the very first night, I just hammered the point that in order to understand the Bible, we have to practice solid hermeneutic, proper exegesis. And I said that in one speech after another. And my opponent, who was a great guy, by the way, he was a friend of mine. He was a Baptist. I was a member of the Church of Christ. And he finally got up after I emphasized the need for exegesis over and over and over again. And he says, well, you know, my friend Don, he keeps saying we need to engage in solid exegesis. And he said, well, I'm here to tell you, folks, we don't need exegesis. All we need is Jesus. Well, you know, that sounds, it sounds good, almost. But you know what, folks? Unless we engage in solid exegesis, proper exegesis, we don't even know the real Jesus. Because we may be importing, we may be reading into the text about Jesus our own preconceived ideas about him. That's why I'm spending the time that I am. The challenge of Christ. If I don't do what I tell you I'm going to do, don't believe me. What was Jesus' statement about what he was going to do? The Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels, and shall reward every man according to his works. And verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. There it is. Okay, we've gone from there to examine the doctrine of those who say, well, the transfiguration was the fulfillment of that. I've shown you why it's not true. I have shown you that Peter gave the vision of the transfiguration as proof positive of the second coming of Christ. It was a vision that confirmed the prophetic word of the second coming. But Jesus did not say, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see a vision of my coming. He said, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his, pardon me, until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So last week, actually a couple of weeks before that, I began sharing with you a few preliminary thoughts on 2 Peter chapter 3. Now look, you have to understand something. I was raised as a fifth generation member of the amillennial view of eschatology. I believed firmly that one of these days, at the, quote, end of time, every human being who has ever lived and died and decomposed, and their particles and their atoms and their molecules consumed by the earth and by fish and birds and wild animals or whatever, will be reconstituted, restored, and revived, raised from the dead. And I believed firmly that would occur at a time when Jesus, as a 5'5" Jewish man, would come out of heaven and, quote, every eye shall see him. Revelation 1:7. I never gave a lot of thought to how in the world, if Christ is here and the globe is here, how the folks on this side of the globe could see him coming on the clouds on the top of the globe. I mean, you know, they're down here. Here's the globe. They're down here. He's up here. Never dawned on me to ask that question, but folks, that's a valid question. Anyway, I came to realize that doctrine is absolutely false. One of the very first passages that I realized was not actually talking about the end of time. Do you realize the Bible never talks about the end of time? Do you realize the Jews never expected the end of time? But the key passage, you know, the one that I always ran to prove that there was going to be an end of time and the earth and the elements that are therein are going to be burned up in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, was 2 Peter chapter 3. Well, let me share with you what is an absolutely fundamental aspect of the amillennial world in which I was raised. I will illustrate that doctrine by sharing with you an anecdote. In 1991, I was engaged in a formal public debate with a man by the name of Bill Lockwood. Now, Bill Lockwood was also a member of the Church of Christ. He was an adherent to the amillennial view that I had once shared or believed. He and I had agreed that we could exchange written questions prior to the debate, and that those answers would be given prior to the beginning of the oral part of the debate. One of the questions that I asked Mr. Lockwood: are your eschatological hopes based upon, taken from God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel? Yes or no? In other words, I was asking him if he was looking for a yet future fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. He handed the sheet back to me, and out beside that question, in great big capital letters, underlined 3 times with 3 exclamation points, underlined was the word no. Well, you see, I knew how he would answer, because as a former advocate of that amillennial view, one of the underlying foundational doctrines of my upbringing was the law of Moses was removed at the cross. I mean, after all, Paul supposedly said that Christ removed the cross, removed the handwriting of ordinances which was against us, which was contrary to us, and he took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross, Colossians 2:15 and 16. And that supposedly referred to the law itself being nailed to the cross, and I believed that. Until I began to look closer at what Paul actually said. And he wasn't even talking about the law itself. But that's another issue that we'll talk about later. So my presupposition growing up was the law of Moses was removed at the cross. God was through with Old Covenant Israel at the cross. And so one day I'm reading the scriptures, and I'm reading Acts 24:13 and following, in which Paul said, "And now I confess to you that after the way which these men call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things that are written in the law and the prophets, that there is about to be the resurrection of the just and of the unjust." This, I confess to you, that after the way that they call heresy, now I left part of it out on purpose. I believe that there's about to be the resurrection of the just and the unjust. And it was a hope that Paul said, to which these men agree. And I believe that the resurrection is found in the law and the prophets. And I'm going, whoa, wait a minute. In Acts 25, Paul appealed to the Old Testament for his resurrection doctrine. In Acts chapter 26, 6-9, still on trial, Paul appealed to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he said, why should it be counted strange to you, O Agrippa, concerning the resurrection, to which hope our 12 tribes eagerly hope to attain? Oh, wait a minute. Where did the 12 tribes get their doctrine and their hope of the resurrection? Well, they didn't have 1 Corinthians 15. And he's talking about Old Covenant 12 tribes. He's not talking about the church as the 12 tribes. And then in Acts 26, 21 and following, Paul says, and now having obtained help from God, I stand before kings and before governors and before all who are in authority, saying, listen to me, catch the power of this, no other things than what Moses, the law, and the prophets said should come, and that Christ would be the first to be raised from the dead, and to give life and light to the Gentiles. And again, I'm going, wait a minute. Something's wrong here. I believed at that time that God was through with Israel. God was through with the Old Testament at the cross. I sat at my desk and I pondered. Wait a minute. If God was through with Israel, Old Covenant Israel, at the cross, and if God was through with the Old Testament at the cross, then how could Paul still be appealing to those Old Testament prophecies given to Old Covenant Israel for his hope of the resurrection? I mean, wow, somebody needed to set Paul straight. Paul, don't you know you're contradicting yourself? Don't you know that you wrote in Colossians and in Ephesians that God was through with the law at the cross? Don't you remember, Paul, that you told us that God was through with Israel at the cross? But you see, the problem wasn't Paul, and it wasn't Paul contradicting himself. It was Paul contradicting me. And I had to come face to face with that reality. That challenging reality of the challenge of Christ. Because you see, this is all interwoven and wrapped up with itself. So, if Paul and the New Testament writers, and by the way, I won't take all the time here to chronicle how every New Testament writer says the same thing that Paul did. Their eschatological hope was nothing but the expectation of the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. They were not New Covenant promises made to the New Covenant Israel, divorced from Old Covenant Israel and the law of Moses. It was the same promise. So, having laid all of that groundwork, all right, let me remind you of what I shared with you last week. And let me reiterate this challenge of Christ. If God was through with Israel at the cross, if God was through with the old law at the cross, then how could all, not just a few, how could all of the New Covenant writers, the New Testament writers, say they were looking for the imminent fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel in the law of Moses and the prophets? Look, folks, if the law of Moses was removed, annulled, and abrogated at the cross, then all of those promises were removed at the cross. But do you remember what I shared with you last week? Last week I shared with you Matthew 5:17 and 18, in which Jesus, standing there on the Mount for the Sermon on the Mount, told that audience, vast multitude, "Do not think that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill the law and the prophets. For verily I say unto you," do you remember what that little term, "verily I say unto you," means? I've shared it with you before when we looked in depth at Matthew 16:27 and 28. The little Greek term, amen lego humin, draws attention to what is about to be said that will emphasize what has just been said. That means that Matthew 5:18 emphasizes verse 17. So what does verse 18 say? "Verily I say unto you, not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law until it is all fulfilled." So, let me challenge you with this. In 2 Peter chapter 3, we have the prediction of the day of the Lord, right? The day of the Lord in which, quote, "the earth and the elements therein shall be burned up," unquote. The day of the Lord in which, according to his promise, we look for a new heaven and a new earth, unquote. Verse 13. Now, remember, please catch the power of this. The promise of the day of the Lord of 2 Peter chapter 3, the promise of the new heaven and new earth of 2 Peter chapter 3 is a promise that Peter tells us in 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 1 and 2, "Beloved, I now write this second epistle to you, in both of which to stir up your holy minds by way of remembrance, that you would be mindful of the words which were spoken before by the holy prophets." That's the Old Testament prophets. So Peter says, "Brethren, I'm writing to you about the day of the Lord, about the new heaven and new earth that was spoken of by the Old Covenant prophets." Okay, what did Jesus say in Matthew 5:17 and 18? "Do not think that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill the law and the prophets." Please, if you've got a notebook sitting here handy, please write down the following argument. Not one jot or one tittle of the law and the prophets could pass away until every jot and every tittle of the law and the prophets was fulfilled. Okay? You got that? You got it written down? Not one jot, not one tittle of the law and the prophets could pass away until every jot and every tittle of the law and the prophets was fulfilled. Minor premise. What's known as a minor premise. The first statement is what they call the major premise in formal logic. Minor premise. But the day of the Lord and the coming of the new heaven and the new earth of 2 Peter chapter 3 is taken from the law and the prophets. the Old Covenant law and the prophets. Be sure you write this down. The day of the Lord and the new heaven and new earth of 2 Peter chapter 3 is the expectation of the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Therefore, this is the conclusion. Major premise, minor premise. Now, very quickly, a lesson in logic. If the major premise is true and valid, and if the minor premise is true and valid, then the conclusion absolutely must be true. No way out of it. So, is the major premise true? Jesus said not one jot, not one tittle would pass from the law of Moses, or the prophets until every jot and until every tittle of the law and the prophets was fulfilled. I'm sorry, folks, that's irrefutable. That means the major premise is true. Minor premise. The day of the Lord and the new heaven and new earth of 2 Peter chapter 3 is part of, taken from, based on the law and the prophets. That's the Old Testament law, the Old Testament prophets. So the major premise is absolutely irrefutably true. The minor premise is absolutely irrefutably true. So here is the conclusion. Therefore, the new heaven and the new earth of 2 Peter chapter 3 would only come when the law and the prophets were fulfilled. But if the law and the prophets are not fulfilled until the coming of the new heaven and new earth and the day of the Lord, then guess what? It means the law and the prophets, the law of Moses, remains valid and binding until the so-called end of time. And folks, that is not true. And I'll talk about it more next week.